Welcome to the Equal Opportunities Committee, the 22nd meeting of 2013. Could I ask everyone if they've got any electronic devices to switch them off or put them into flight mode, please? We also have the photographer in the room who will be here for a few moments taking some photographs. I'd also like to start with introductions. At the table, we have our clerking and research team, together with official reporters. Around the room, we are supported by Broadcasting Services and Security Office, and I'd also like to welcome the observers in the public gallery. My name is Margaret McCulloch, and I'm the committee's convener, and I now invite members and witnesses to introduce themselves in turn, starting here on my right.
I'm Marco Biaggi. I'm the Deputy Convener and the MSP for Edinburgh Central.
Morning, I'm Siobhan McMahon, MSP for Central Scotland.
John Mason, MSP for Glasgow Shettleston.
Alec Johnston, MSP North East Scotland.
Good morning, I'm Christian Allard, MSP for the North East of Scotland.
Good morning, John Finney, MSP Highlands and Islands. And Convener, can I take this opportunity to refer to my declaration of interest as a member of Amnesty who are providing evidence later? Thank you.
And I'd also like to welcome on our left, Jim Eder, MSP. Introduce yourself, Jim.
Thank you, Convener. I'm Jim Eder, and I'm the MSP for Edinburgh Southern.
Okay. Reverend, yeah.
Yes, I'm the Reverend Dr. Alan Hamilton. I am a parish minister from Bearsden, and I'm also the convener of the Church of Scotland's Legal Questions Committee.
Thank you.
Brian Borowski, I'm the director of the Scottish Council of Jewish Communities.
David Robertson, I'm Minister of St Peter's Free Church in Dundee, and I'm also the Director of Solas Centre for Public Christianity.
John Arms, I'm Bishop of Edinburgh in the Scottish Episcopal Church, here representing the Faith and Order Board of that church.
Thank you. Can I also start by reminding members that questions to witnesses should come through myself, and that witnesses should also indicate to either myself or the clerk on my left when they wish to speak. I'll now hand over the questioning to John. Would you like to start, please?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. I wonder if I could have your views on whether you would marry people you knew to be infertile.
Yes. Though how I would know, yes, no problem.
Similarly, yes.
I'm not aware that this has ever been debated by the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, but I'm struggling to see a reason why celebrant ministers or deacons wouldn't do so if they were told, which is fairly unlikely.
As you'll be aware from our submission, I speak for a very varied range of diverse opinion within the Jewish community. I'm not aware, like Alan, of anybody having raised the question or of anybody having any concerns about it.
Okay. I have some. I read all your submissions with great interest, Reverend Robertson. With regard to your submission there's a suggestion that Scottish Parliament would be acting ultra vires. Yes. Would you care to expand on that, please?
Yes, I expanded in the paper saying that marriage is what marriage is. When we were deciding, or when David Cameron and others have decided to have same-sex marriage, they've had to redefine marriage for everyone, as Mr. Cameron pointed out. I don't think any parliament has the right to redefine marriage any more than any parliament has the right to say that a circle is a square. I just think it's beyond, there are some things that are beyond the capability of even politicians, and that's one of them. Marriage cannot be redefined in that way.
You also earlier in your paper talk about the relationship between Scottish ministers and the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition in London in that relationship. Would you care to expand on that in relation to this legislation?
Yes, that was put in as a deliberately provocative piece, I'm afraid. It was basically an illustration suggesting that, in actual fact, what is going on here is just following the herd. I've been involved in Scottish politics for 30 years, and it's only in the past 5 years that this has been raised as an issue at all. And all of a sudden, we find that all the political parties, all the major political parties anyway, are saying, oh yes, we're for equality. Well, why weren't they for equality 15 years ago? Why weren't they for equality 10 years ago? I think the definition has changed. So what we were trying to state there was that there has been a push for this, and people are rushing into it without thinking it through. And we were just trying to encourage people to think it through. I do think there are politics involved in this as well, which is what we were trying to say, that there's almost a sense we need to show that Scotland's a progressive country and we need to be ahead of England or the United Kingdom government. So I feel that this whole thing has been rushed, and that's the reason that we put that in there.
I don't know if we want to put on record the actual phrase you used in relation to that at all.
Well, it's there in the thing, so I mean that it's fine. But I think the argument that we are suggesting, and I accept in a sense, and it's an emotive argument, is that this is being driven by politics as much as by ethics, and I don't think that can be denied.
Can I ask the panel about their views on opting out for faith practitioners? An opt-out for, there's references in a number of the submissions in relation to public service employees, for instance. People have a view on that.
Well, I mean, I think the thing is that individual conscience should be respected in a free society. And that doesn't just apply to a very narrow band of people, that applies to everybody if it's to be truly a free society. So if you say, well, if you work for the public sector, you have no right to conscience, which is essentially what you're saying, then that's not a free society any longer. That is becoming an oppressive society.
As I think the Church of Scotland has, as we make clear, has not debated the issue of same-sex marriage or religious civil partnerships. But the Legal Questions Committee, which has been leading the response, is deeply concerned that public servants, whether they be registrars or teachers, particularly those who have begun their employment before the introduction of this bill, or even before this bill was on the horizon. I think the point is well made that it's a relatively recent innovation, that they will find themselves prejudiced, perhaps even lose their jobs, because for reasons which are acceptable, it appears, to the Scottish Government and perhaps to the Scottish Parliament, in relation to celebrants and those who have an integral part in a marriage, if those celebrants are ministers or deacons of the Church of Scotland or other priests or celebrants, that they find themselves potentially at risk, and we believe that there should be equivalent protections for registrars who are obviously on the front line, and if one extends the argument further, to others who will find themselves potentially in positions of considerable conflict, and that would include teachers.
Would you like to contribute?
I'd simply really like to concur with what Alan has just said. I think we would have the similar concerns in the Episcopal Church.
Borowski?
Also, to concur with that, as I said earlier, I represent a community which has within it a number of branches who take diametrically opposed views on this. The one thing on which they are absolutely all in agreement with one another is that there should be no compulsion on any one of them to follow the views of the other. And therefore, whether it's a matter of opting in or opting out, and certainly starting from the current position, it would be necessarily opting in, because this is something that's not possible at the moment. There have to be protections both for the individuals and for the organisations. And much of the detail of our submission is to do with the actual wording of the draft legislation in order to ensure that those protections are maintained and there can't be, as it were, accidental slippage. And we've given several examples of how we think the current wording might result in some people not being able to opt in to do what they want to do because of, for example, the happenstance that they don't have an officially recognised celebrant at the moment, and the wording of the clause is such that they would have to have one from the beginning in order to be able to do it later. And likewise, other people might find themselves compromised because an individual says, I'm prepared to do this, but the organisation they belong to says that they don't want to.
Yes, Reverend Robertson.
Yes. While I would like to think that opting out or opting in would work, I think in reality it won't. I think that at the very least, at the very best, it will last for a short while. My reason for saying that is this, that if you have a state-imposed morality, then, and if you regard the opposition to same-sex marriage as homophobia or equivalent, and therefore equivalent to racism, I don't think anyone in this Parliament would be arguing that if someone wished to be a racist and say, well, I'm not going to marry a black person to a white person, or so on, they would want an opt-in or an opt-out with that. And I think the default moral position here is that those who, out of conviction, rather than political cynicism, are arguing for same-sex marriage, regard this as exactly the same as racism. And therefore, inevitably, what will happen is whatever the good wishes of politicians right now, politicians change every 3 or 4 years, and in my view, this will not work. I would love to think that there will be complete freedom for teachers, for charities, for others to express a view which goes against the zeitgeist of the current culture. But I suspect that that will not be the case.
Mr. Macdonald, would you like to contribute? Are you okay?
Yeah, I mean, I think freedom of conscience for people working across the public sector is crucial. In fact, if the principle of reasonable accommodation is taken on board, which is what should be taken on board in terms of equality legislation in our courts, at Westminster and at Holyrood, and I think there is an opportunity for Holyrood to set an example in this area. But if that principle of reasonable accommodation is taken on board, if you take the example of registrars, you could easily have a situation where a local authority is able to provide a service without imposing on the conscience of any of its staff. That there's no problem in that being facilitated at the local level. The problem is that some people and some organisations want to force people to officiate at same-sex marriages or at same-sex civil partnerships because it's part of an ideological agenda which is being driven. And that will apply not just to civil registrars, but right across the public sector, particularly in schools, but not exclusively in schools. So that's the question you have to ask yourselves is, do you want to shut off careers in the public sector to people who have a conscientious objection to saying that marriage is between two people of the same sex? And for many people of faith and others, this is a fundamental point. This is equivalent to a doctor performing an abortion. It is of equivalent moral significance. In fact, it may even be of more significance.
We make, I think, two distinctions in our submission which are relevant to what Gordon just said. One is the distinction between, shall we say, rural areas and urban areas, where one can expect normally that in urban areas there would be the possibility for reasonable accommodation. If a particular registrar doesn't want to get involved in something, he or she has colleagues who could take over, who could be scheduled to that shift or whatever it might be. The other distinction is between people who are already in post and have a reasonable expectation as to what the job involved when they applied for it and were appointed, and people who take up a post from now on, knowing what the new legislation is. And I think what worries me is, for example, the Ladele case, where there is no doubt that there were other people in Islington who could have undertaken that duty, and where she had been in post for many years. So she, in fact, if you think about the two distinctions, obviously produces 4 classes. She should have been in the most protected class, having been in post in an urban area with other people who could have been scheduled to do it. And nonetheless, that became the crux of a case that has gone all the way to Europe.
I would say that the European Court of Human Rights does recognise a margin of appreciation for nation states. And so whilst in the UK courts did not support Ladele in her case, In the Netherlands, the Parliament and the courts have ruled that, that reasonable accommodation, that registrars don't necessarily have to perform the function, that facility can be made. So it would be within the competence of the Scottish courts to come to that view. And if the Parliament obviously gave a lead on that, then that might increase that chance.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. And we'll now... John, okay.
If I may, Convener, thanks. I wonder, if I noted you correctly, Mr Robertson, you talked about complete freedom. I wonder if the panel would see that extending to, for instance, a teacher who's an atheist, not referring to God.
Yes, totally. I mean, to ask a teacher who's an atheist, for example, to lead in an act of Christian worship would be an act of supreme hypocrisy. To ask a teacher who's an atheist not to refer to God would be completely stupid, in the same way as to ask somebody like me who doesn't agree with same-sex marriage not to refer to same-sex marriage would also be stupid. People are allowed different views. If a teacher is asked, are you an atheist or do you believe in God? I'm sorry, I'm not allowed to refer to God. Freedom would of course allow them to refer to God.
I believe there's safeguards at the moment regarding the difference between views that creationists would take in regard to teaching in schools?
Well, I'm not sure what creationism has to do with this, and I presume by creationism you mean young earth creationism, and I assume that we're referring to the kind of panic that people get, oh dear, someone may actually believe that, you know, God created the earth or did it 6,000 years ago. My view is that religious philosophy should be taught in philosophy classes, and science should be taught in science classes. It's as simple as that. I don't think we should be bringing politics into any of politics or religion into science classes. And the fact that someone is an atheist or a Christian in a science class is completely irrelevant to what science they teach.
Would any of the other witnesses like to comment?
I think that's a fair analysis. I'm struggling to see the connection between creationism, a belief in creationism, and the issue that's here today, not least because there are so many different...
My reference was to freedom. So, for instance, let me give you a ridiculous example, another example. If a local authority street sweeper said, well, I don't agree with the views of that religion, I don't want to sweep the street outside that particular building, would that be reasonable?
It would only be reasonable if his religion involves street sweeping, which it clearly doesn't. On the other hand, my religion and most people's religion, and particularly those of us who are officials in it, being married is a religious thing and it's a big act. So the analogy is irrelevant. I mean, I know what you're trying to say, but it doesn't work. Logically, it just doesn't work, not in the real world.
I think it's certainly possible in a school environment to have a discussion about the law changing and same-sex marriage being introduced without it being seen as advocacy or promotion of an ideology. The problem we have with some of the resources which are targeted by Stonewall at Primary 1 and Primary 2 is that they're clearly advocacy, and there is no guarantee that parents will have a right to withdraw their children, because the resources might well be used not in a sex education class but in a reading class, and then there would be no legal right to withdraw their children. So that's the problem. That doesn't mean that you can't have a discussion in modern studies in fourth year about the Scottish Parliament's Marriage and Civil Partnerships Bill and the campaign that went around it. You know, that's, you know, they're completely different scenarios that we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, Marco, Biagio.
Just as a supplementary to that, I mean, there's a lot of literature, for example, that has been written purposefully for the purposes of, you know, I think you drew attention to King and King in submission, but how did this extend to mainstream literature that may, for example, have homosexual relations in it? Is that something that shouldn't be available to children? Moll Flanders, for example.
The point we are making is that parents should have a right to know what their children are being taught and have a right to withdraw if they're unhappy with it without fear of being prosecuted, as is in apparently the threat that's happening south of the border. So that seems to me an issue of parental choice and freedom and respecting the rights of parents to have their children educated in accordance with their religious and philosophical beliefs, rather than a discussion about whether or not this or that particular resource should be used in this or that particular class.
Thank you, and we'll now move on to Siobhan McMahon.
Thank you, Convener. A number of organisations and individuals who are in support of the bill have written submissions to us that suggest that the robust protections in the bill. I was just wondering if you share that view, and if you don't, which I presume you don't, what would be the reasons for that? And if you can think of anything that could be put into the bill to make it workable for your own religious body?
Very weak protections in the bill, to be honest. I think the Scottish Government's intent is probably honourable. I would take them at face value in what they say, but I don't think they've backed it up with legislative support. In a sense, what the Scottish Government have sort of indicated to us informally as well, you know, this is Scotland, everybody knows each other, we're all friends here, nobody's going to do the sorts of things that happen in England. Therefore, we don't need legal protection. It can all be guaranteed by guidance and by a sort of informal agreement with the Registrar General, etc. You know, that's, or the Lord Advocate, that's the approach which the SNP government has taken, and or the Scottish government has taken. So I don't think that's sufficient. I think there are things that the Scottish Parliament can do in terms of legislation to protect charities, for example. You can look at the definition of public benefit, or more significantly the definition of public disbenefit, and you can change the charity legislation so that Oscar can't do to churches what they're doing to St Margaret's Adoption Agency at the moment. You could do things to do with, you know, you could introduce a statutory right for parents to be informed and to withdraw their children if they are uncomfortable with what they're being taught, depending obviously on the age of the child. You could look at, you know, there are other things that you can do under devolved legislation, but equally, I think you've got quite a lot of political clout in terms of influencing the Westminster government, and certainly you could seek to get a stronger agreement for the amendment of the Equality Act from the Westminster government, and that would be, I would encourage you to do that. Indeed, I would draw your attention to what the Faculty of Advocates have said, and I'd encourage you to ask them their views, because they do say that the current agreement which the Scottish Government has come up with is not watertight and could well be challenged, both in terms of chaplains and people working in the public sector, but also in terms of some religious celebrants being forced by their denomination to participate, even if it goes against their conscience.
Thank you, Convener. The Church of Scotland would broadly share these concerns. There are two important points to be made. Well, three. I think the first one I'd like to make is that the Church of Scotland has no doubt that the Scottish Government is offering the protections that it is offering in good faith, and is seeking to preserve the right of individual religious bodies and their celebrants to make a decision here. However, we have not seen two important parts of the scheme, because it's not just contained in the bill that's before the Parliament. It will be contained in delegated legislation, which we have not seen, and it will also be contained in an amendment to the UK Equality Act 2010, which we have the gist of what it might be, but we have not seen the wording. So these are two very, very important caveats, to which I would add a fourth. There is deep concern that even if everything falls into place, as the Scottish Government would like it to do, then there is deep concern that is in fact going to be ineffective in the face of a sustained challenge under the European Convention on Human Rights. Once same-sex marriage is introduced, then it will be extraordinarily difficult for a government, a state, to discriminate. So if the Scottish Government the Scottish Parliament introduces same-sex marriage, then the Scottish Government, the state, will find it extremely difficult to either discriminate itself or allow others to do so. And this is why we have introduced in sections 19 and 20 of our submission the suggestion that there may be the vulnerabilities of the proposed scheme may be reduced if religious and belief bodies, instead of being agents of the state in carrying out marriages, as is currently envisaged in the statutory scheme, if instead they were simply recognised, the religious ceremonies which they offered were simply recognised as by the state as being efficacious in marrying two people. So a religious body or a belief body would carry out what is essentially a religious ceremony, a private religious ceremony, but the state would recognise it. We believe that this would reduce the vulnerability of the current scheme because religious or indeed belief bodies would not be seen as agents of the state. And we'd urge the Scottish Parliament to consider this. But nevertheless, even with this innovation, we have deep concerns that when challenged, this will all unravel, and there's plenty of high-level legal opinion to that effect. We're also concerned that this is an invitation to take religious bodies in particular through the court system. We are voluntary bodies. We rely upon the giving donations of our members. And the thought of years of exhausting legal challenge, which is also incredibly expensive, is really very concerning. And that is why the General Assembly of 2013, in May of this year, instructed my committee to, together with other councils and committees of the Church of Scotland, to consider whether, in fact, and I'm saying this colloquially, this is not the terms of the deliverance of the General Assembly, whether, in fact, the Church of Scotland, it's actually worth the Church of Scotland continuing to offer marriages in Scotland. It gives us considerable problems internally, and we're deeply concerned about the threat externally.
To just clarify, the issue comes down to what a public function is. And I'd certainly encourage you when the minister comes to ask him what he thinks a public function is and whether a minister of religion marrying people is performing a public function. Because in the Liddell case, the court ruled that she was a public authority because she performed a public function. And yet the public function that a civil registrar performs is exactly the same public function that a minister of religion or religious celebrant performs. So therefore it then becomes an issue of balance of rights. And what a court would rule as regards balance of rights may very well change over time, and it may very well change from one jurisdiction to a different jurisdiction.
I suppose the counter to that, Mr Macdonald, would be that the registrar at the moment is seen as someone who performs a function for the local authority, whereas the religious celebrant does so for their church or organisation.
Well, the religious celebrant does so for the government, but they do it within the context of a religious service.
Okay, thank you. Obviously, some of you have answered already, but I was just wondering your views on the equality impact assessment that was taken when the consultation took place, because the Scottish Government, although have said they do not wish for anyone to be forced into performing ceremonies, they have said that their assurances may not be guaranteed, and that was in the equality impact assessment. So I just wondered if you have views on that.
If I may, I think there are three aspects. One relates to what Alan Gordon have already said about the external challenges to the proposed legislation. And that's not something we've addressed directly in our submission. What we've addressed is internal gaps, as I said earlier, where the precise drafting means that the protections that are clearly intended by the draft bill may not actually be watertight, and that's the aspect that we've addressed there. But there's also, as far as the more general questions of equality impact are concerned, we've also drawn attention to a couple of things which are maybe partially internal and partially external, which suggests that there is a lack of equality of arms, as it were, between the two sides in this debate. Clearly, there are strongly held ethical views on both sides. It's therefore, we've commented, that it's a matter of some concern, for example, that the Lord Advocate produces guidance to do with people who might be prosecuted for expressing their opposition to this in a particularly strong manner, but not guidance for people, the prosecution of people who express their support of it. And that comes back also to the points that have already been made about what goes on, shall we say, in classrooms, and the way in which that is presented, where there doesn't seem to be the same kind of concern for the distinction that's already very clearly made between religious education as it's now understood and religious instruction. And that's very similar, in my view at any rate, to the kind of point that was being made earlier on my left about how such things are taught and the distinction between religious and moral education on the one hand and science education on the other.
Yeah, my concern is not so much with the clergy, to be honest. We can look after ourselves. It's with other people who find themselves victims of discrimination. I think it's a fundamental axiom of the way that those who rule us, govern and educate, is that they will discriminate against discrimination. The minute that, and rather cleverly, those who are for same-sex marriage started calling it equal marriage, and people now get asked, are you for equal marriage? The whole ball game has completely changed. I don't think any protections that are put in place by this Parliament will ultimately last if the conception is that this is about equality. Because if it's about equality, then no one should be allowed to do something that is unjust and unequal, and the Parliament will not legislate on that basis. So to me, at the moment, this is a kind of thing that's saying, well, let's help and get this through. But ultimately, we are going to end up with a situation where people who are opposed to same-sex marriage will automatically be regarded as bigots, as people who are discriminatory, and therefore should be discriminated against. And I think you will find that where schools do not teach the new morality, where charities do not accept the new morality, that within a very short space of time, that we will be legislated against. We don't even need to be legislated. I think the courts will find that we will get hammered. So.
Bishop Arms, would you like to comment? Or are you okay?
Yes, I think I'm okay. I'm finding that probably the Scottish Episcopal Church would be placed in a slightly different place on the spectrum to some of the other views that we've had. But clearly, we express a very wide spectrum, and there were people firmly in favour of this legislation. On the one hand, people very wary of it and concerned about it on the other. So it's very important to us that whatever is built into the legislation does protect those people who might be against it.
Okay. Just one final question, if I may. The Church of Scotland submission, at point 9, it said if the Church were to change its position on marriage to include same-sex marriage, such a change would only be enacted in the law of the Church under its Barrier Act 1697. I was just wondering how complicated that would be, or is it a simple thing to do, given I'm not familiar with your church law?
I'm sure my colleagues in the public gallery would agree nothing in the Church of Scotland is simple. No, if there were... I think it's important to say, to acknowledge that there is diversity of views within the Church of Scotland, and we're currently debating a number of issues in relating to same-sex issues. I think it's also a matter of common wisdom that the fault lines over same-sex marriage fall differently than in the broader issue of same-sex relationships. So there would undoubtedly have to be a period of discussion and debate. Because this is such an important issue, even after that prolonged period, there would be a decision of one General Assembly. They would then, if the decision was in favour of the denomination allowing its celebrants to carry out same-sex marriage, I don't think we'd ever force our celebrants to do that, then the decision of one General Assembly would have to be followed by a confirmatory decision of a majority of the presbyteries of the Church of Scotland over the next 12 months, followed by a second decision saying yes by the succeeding General Assembly. So it's not straightforward, but these things do happen.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
Alex, do you want to come in a supplementary?
It wasn't a supplementary, it was a different line entirely. So if there's anyone else who wants to...
No, I think we're okay. I'll allow you to carry on.
Okay, thank you very much. Since we started this session this morning, we have gone into quite a degree of detail on a number of subjects, but I don't want to miss the opportunity to talk about the more general issue that we're dealing with here. Now, I've read through the submissions and I haven't ticked off the boxes, but most of the evidence that you've submitted in writing does take the opportunity to talk about marriage as the basis for family and for the rearing of children. Now, The first thing I'd like to ask is there anything specific that you would like to say in relation to the role of marriage as providing a stable basis for the rearing of children?
I think that it's good that the committee looks at the issue of the bill in principle at this stage and not just at the details, because part of my fear has been that the whole focus will be on the details. And so the question you have to ask yourselves is, what is marriage? Is marriage just a subjective expression of love between two individuals, or is it more than that? Has it got some sort of objective reality? And in particular, what is the state's interest in legislating for marriage? And it seems to me that over history and throughout societies, the state's interest in legislating for marriage is because it is the context in which children are normally produced and reared, and it is the most stable and secure context. And if you look at the sociological data, you will see that children perform better if they come from a married parent's family than from a single-parent family or from some sort of other broken home. So that being the case, I think that the state has an interest, an objective interest in recognising marriage in law and in legislation. In terms of whether or not people love each other, the state has never really been that interested in whether or not a man marrying a woman love each other. What they're interested in is, are they making a commitment to stay together, and are they going to provide a framework in which any children are raised? That is what the state has been interested in. Indeed, in history there were many society marriages which were not love marriages, they were society marriages. That doesn't happen so much any longer, but it used to happen. So that has been a historic development in that sense. But the point I'm trying to make is that the state's interest is purely in relation to the production of children and the raising of the next generation and the security and the stability of society. And so it seems to me that is why the complementarity of male and female, the biological complementarity of male and female, is crucial to the essence of what marriage is.
Over my lifetime, and probably for a while before that, there's a perception that the strength of marriage and its role within society and the strength of family life has been weakening, with a number of obvious impacts on the way society conducts itself. Do you believe that the weakening of the status of marriage has weakened family life?
The increase in the amount of divorce, the increase in the amount of cohabitation has almost certainly led to instability in society and in families. And indeed, even the official report into the riots that happened in England mentioned the fact that most of the people who participated came from broken homes. So, I mean, it's a different issue from what this bill is about. But I think the decline of marriage as a social norm cannot be divorced from a whole range of social problems that have arisen in our society.
In relation to the proposals that are contained within this bill, it's often the case that when politicians, or many others for that matter, discuss key issues, we use phrases like, all other things being equal, how will this change perceptions? Do you think the changes contained in this bill can be discussed with the assumption that it will not have an impact on the status of marriage in other respects?
It redefines marriage, actually. It fundamentally redefines marriage. It ceases to be a relationship between a man and a woman with a complementarity of two genders. It becomes a relationship between two people of the same sex. I think you get into even more confusion when you get into the whole transgender area, and that came out at what used to be called the Subordinate Legislation Committee this week, actually, which some of you are members of. So I think that you do open up the principle that marriage can be redefined in any way you wish, any way the state wishes. Whether the state has the authority to do that is perhaps not a position Scotland for Marriage would take a view on, but it's certainly a position that churches would take a view on in terms of their understanding of the relationship between church and state.
Should this change in legislation take place, do you think it strengthens or weakens marriage as one of the foundations on which family life and society as a whole is based?
I do personally, but I'll let somebody else comment as well.
Bevan Robertson.
I think, Mr. Johnson, you're actually hitting the heart of the issue here. Two things that you've said that are, I think, are particularly perceptive. First of all, this bill will not initiate a major change or decline in marriage. The marriage was getting on fine and so on. I think there's been a decline in marriage and its value in society for a long, long time. And this is just part of that process. I mean, I would like to see that reversed. I would like to see that. But I do believe that it's because the understanding about marriage has become so weak that this bill is just taken as a given by so many people because it's just about equality. I actually think it's very difficult. I wrote a letter to David Cameron and spoke with the Liberal Democrat spokesperson who drew up the British government's legislation on this. And he basically admitted that they couldn't define marriage. Now, how do you redefine marriage if you cannot define it? And my fear is that what's happening here is this is part of a process and that marriage is now going to be reduced. If this bill passes in this Parliament, all marriages will become civil partnerships. I think it's a move away, very much a move away from the Christian teaching of marriage on which our society has been based for well over 1,000 years. And therefore, I mean, my appeal would be to MSPs not to vote for this, but to think about the enormous social consequences that will occur because of this change. Even though it's the zeitgeist, even though there's enormous pressure, I think that MSPs should say no, not at least until we've looked at what the consequences will be, because this will accelerate the decline in marriage and the social and economic consequences will be phenomenal.
Can I actually bring Marco in on a supplementary, please?
Can you explain to me how increasing the number of people getting married each year will cause a decline in marriage?
Because you're redefining marriage for everybody. So you are changing what marriage is. So you are turning all marriages into civil partnerships.
Thank you, Convener. As I've said repeatedly, the Church of Scotland's General Assembly has not debated this, but there are certainly folk within the Church who would agree with what Mr. Robertson and Dr. Macdonald have said. Even those who do not are anxious that this is we are moving very much into uncharted territory here. And that unless we are saying that marriage between a man and a woman is of no real significance in society, then, and really isn't that important anyway, then to redefine it so significantly without the kind of debate that we feel should take place, the kind of research and discussion over a protracted period, because this is extremely important, and not just theologically, although of course we would argue that our theology is in fact also our understanding of society, that this is moving too far, too fast. It is of deep concern to some folk within the Church of Scotland that there should be, in fact, deep concern, I think, to almost everyone in the Church of Scotland, that there should be protection for everybody, regardless of sexual orientation, whether heterosexual or homosexual, and that there should also be equality. But I think there's also concern that this is moving beyond equality, given what is available to same-sex couples under the Civil Partnership legislation. And this is a move towards beyond equality into sameness. And this is, I think, another issue that concerns us and we don't believe has been properly considered. But as I say, this is the view of my committee. The General Assembly has not yet debated the matter.
I think
Bishop Arms, sorry, can I take Bishop Arms?
Sorry, yes, the Episcopal Church has a similar process that we're part of, where we're really needing to discuss in some depth with all the different views within the Church, which I think are pretty representative of the views of the public at large, to see where we go on this. And as I would support what Mr. Hamilton said about a long and more protracted series of discussions which deal with some of these issues. Yes, there are some people in our Church who would take a very conservative line on matters of marriage, as being between a man and a woman. But there'd be other people who would take the point of view that marriage is about a covenanted relationship of love. And in that sense, it's not about equality, it's about love. And they would see that the opportunity for people of whatever gender to form an alliance in marriage is something which strengthens marriage. So I don't think, I wouldn't want the impression to be gained from this conversation that everyone in our churches has the same mind on this.
Thank you. Can we now move on to John Mason, who has some questions to ask also?
Thanks very much, Convener. Starting with the Free Church paper, I think I would like to put on record my strong disagreement with the suggestion that the Scottish Parliament was acting as a tool of the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition in London. I'm not entirely happy about this bill, but I think for whatever the reason for it was not to be a tool of the Conservative Liberal Democratic coalition. Anyway, on the point of Mr. Robertson, perhaps, of what right does the state have? It has been suggested that marriage involves 3 contracts between the 2 people themselves, between the 2 people and the state, and between the 2 people and God. So, on the point of 2 people in the state, does the state not have the right to get involved there?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. First of all, apologies for the remark which came from my friend and colleague Gordon Wilson, who's turning into somewhat of a radical in his old age, but he promises not to try and expel Mr. Salmond again. On your substantive point, I think the state, if you want to put it that way, has the right to legislate any civil contracts that it wants. My dispute is that marriage is not just a civil contract. And I think the state does not have the right to take to itself to try and change the age-old institution of marriage to, well, basically, it will destroy marriage. It's turning all marriages into civil contracts. I was intrigued, again, referring back to the Westminster Parliament, how adultery will not be grounds for divorce in a same-sex marriage. And then there was a discussion about children and so on. And it seems to me that in the bizarre world that we live in, that our governments are telling us that marriage is now to be redefined as genderless, sexless, as childless, and as faithless. And to me, that's an absurd position that we find ourselves in. The state can decide any civil contracts that it wishes. What I object to is the state saying we're going to make all marriages a civil contract.
Okay, thanks very much. On a separate point, in the Humanist Society, who are coming later, they've suggested that the Church of Scotland has been put in a privileged position, and that should not be the case. Does the Church of Scotland believe it should have a privileged position compared to other Christian churches?
Well, the Church of Scotland believes that it has a responsible position, and no less so than any other church. We believe that we have a responsibility to all the people of Scotland, regardless of religious belief or indeed of sexual orientation. And that is where we are. How the state reflects the position of the Church of Scotland in the national life of the church the national life of the country is really up to the state. But we don't seek a privileged position.
Do any of the others want to comment on that, about the position of the Church of Scotland, or are you all happy to leave that?
Perhaps, Convener, I could ask this question. I'm not entirely sure in what way the Church of Scotland is deemed to be privileged.
I think even the fact it was mentioned specifically as a denomination, whereas other denominations have not been mentioned in the legislation.
Does that make the Church of Scotland privileged?
Well, certainly in some people's view it does. I just wanted to hear your view. I'll ask the Humanists later what they think.
I just wanted to take the opportunity to reiterate a related point, I think, from our submission, which is not to do with the alleged privileged position of the Church of Scotland, but the distinction between religious and belief ceremonies, marriages, etc. It's been, I think, correctly recognised that the humanists feel to some extent compromised by the fact that the current fudge, for want of a better expression, allows them to conduct what are referred to as religious marriages. And therefore they want to be able to do what they currently do, but not to have it labelled religious. That's perfectly acceptable. But the result of what is currently proposed is that the religious aspect of genuinely religious ceremonies is kind of removed because they are all now they're left in the same basket, but the distinction, which is I think a significant distinction, which all of my colleagues have actually founded on at various points in their answers to other questions, disappears, and we are therefore suggesting what looks like a trivial grammatical drafting change from religious and belief marriage, religious and belief ceremony, etc., to religious marriage and belief marriage, religious ceremony and belief ceremony, because we believe that the distinction still exists and should not be in this way elided.
Thanks. Could I pick up, Mr. Armas, on something you said, which I think your definition of marriage was to do with, quote, a covenanted relationship in love. Was that the words you used? I'm just wondering then why we restrict that to two people. Because in Christian tradition, I read scripture both in Jewish and Christian literature. I've lived in Nepal, Hindu society, Muslim society. In a lot of them, they've had the tradition of one man and more than one wife, say two wives. And if people are willingly wanting to go into that relationship, knowing that there will be three people in it, especially the two women accepting that there would be three people in it, would you also be happy for that to be one of the definitions of marriage as a covenanted relationship in love?
It's an interesting question, but I think my answer to that would be no. That's not to say that clearly marriage has existed in different forms in different cultures over the centuries in many different ways. And that's why I think this whole question about whether the state has the right to define marriage or say who can get married is a relevant one, but I myself and the church I represent would say that the state does have that right. And so therefore, if the state were to say that marriage could be between three people or four people or more, then I suppose the state would have the right to do that. But within the context of the Christian faith, then marriage certainly has always been between two people. And I think for me, the idea of the covenanted aspect of the relationship is that it is a covenant between two people.
But would it not also be correct to say that in Christian tradition it's always been one man and one woman?
Yes, it has.
So if you're changing Christian tradition in one way, you'd be reasonably relaxed about changing it in another way?
Well, no. That's the conversation we're engaged in at the moment. Certainly part of our conversation will not be whether people can marry more than one spouse at one time. But the point of view I put across about a covenant of relationship and love is one which is shared by some people at one part of our church, but wouldn't be shared by others. So that's precisely the kind of conversation we need to get into in our church and are engaged with at the moment, before we can really reach any decision as to whether we can participate in officiating at same-sex marriages.
Okay, thanks. Can I have one other?
We're actually quite tight for time. We're actually running quite tight for time, so can I ask to ensure that we can get the other members in to ask questions, that your answers can be concise, and I'll now pass you on to Marco Biaggi.
Thank you. A lot of the areas I wanted to ask have actually been covered. To the Free Church, you were referring to the definition. The definition seems very important to you. Can I just clarify something you said, that the difference between marriage and civil partnership is that marriage is sacred and civil partnership is just a civil contract. Is that right?
No, it's more than that. But you say sacred, I mean, by definition, I think that what you are doing in putting forward this legislation is turning every marriage into a civil contract, yes.
Right. And can I just ask, do you support the existing civil partnerships legislation?
I think that's up for the government. The government can do that. If you're asking, I happen to believe the traditional Christian teaching that sex should be between a man and a woman in the confines of marriage. Now, I realise that that's deeply unfashionable. That's not the issue here, though.
With regard to the definition, you referred before to having the discussion with the Whitehall official or the politician, or whoever it was, and asked to define marriage, and they said they couldn't. Would you say you've got a reasonably robust definition within your faith of what marriage is?
Yes, it's there in the paper. The response that he initially gave was that marriage is between two people who love one another. The logical position, which people throw their hands up in horror and have a heart attack at, is to say, well, if that's the case, then there's nothing wrong with me marrying my adult son if we love one another. I mean, using it in that way, it's very emotive and it sounds great in the press. But as a basis for law, two people who love one another is an absurd definition of marriage. My definition is, or our definition is written down in the paper, and it's basically the Catholic, Christian, Orthodox position. The meaning of marriage is straightforward. It's the union between one man and one woman for the threefold purpose of mutual companionship, the procreation and upbringing of children in a secure environment, and the good of society.
Now, I appreciate that you've already said you would marry infertile couples, so that already casts some doubt on that. But what my concern is do you have a slightly different definition? Do each of you have different definitions? We've already heard, for example, that one of the Jewish communities has its own interpretation of what marriage should be, and that the Episcopal Church has a variety of interpretations within it, and you're coming to a position. So is it the case that there are multiple definitions out there?
Can we have Bishop?
Bishop, perhaps.
Well, the Episcopal Church, in terms of its Canon 31, which is part of its submission, says that the marriage is a physical, spiritual, mystical union of one man and one woman, created by their mutual consent of heart, mind, and will thereto, and is a holy and lifelong estate instituted of God. That's how we define marriage, and I would think that's pretty much in step with most Christian churches at the moment. What I'm saying is that within our church, partly challenged by what's abroad in the state at large, the challenge we're facing is whether we need to rethink that. But at the moment, that is where we stand. That is what constitutes marriage in the Episcopal Church. And if that is to change, we have to undergo quite a long conversation and discussion and decisions before we can accept that any of our ministers can preside at a marriage of two people of the same gender.
Convener, if I could add very briefly, there are undoubtedly nuances, theological nuances in relation to expressions of understanding of marriage across churches and across religious traditions. But the issue that is here is whether marriage is only between a man and a woman, one man and one woman, or not. And certainly it is the historical Catholic with a small c tradition, Christian tradition, that it is. If the Scottish Government, Scottish Parliament wishes churches to change that, then it needs to recognise that this is an immense ask. It's a huge ask for us to depart from our historical position.
What way does the Scottish Government want churches to change their definition?
It is, well, it's offering the possibility.
That's a very different prospect legally.
Well, if the Scottish Government's opt-in provisions are efficacious, yes, but we are not convinced that they are.
So, were the opt-in provisions to be robust and protected against any challenge, would you therefore have no objection to the bill?
Well, what we have been asked all along, and what we were asked particularly in the consultations, was would we support? That is, the Scottish Government has introduced legislation and asked whether we would support it. So to that extent, it is asking us for our support. And we cannot give that because our position in relation to human sexuality remains unchanged. And it is the historic Catholic Orthodox position that is followed by Christians, most Christians around the world. What I'm saying is, if the Scottish Government wants our support, then we will have to change and make, and it is a big ask for us. And the real issue is not nuances about how we understand marriage. The issue here, the one that the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament is focusing upon, is one simple issue. Is marriage between one man and one woman, or can marriage be between people of the same sex?
And I think in terms of the issue of principle, if you make that jump and say, well, marriage is not just between one man and one woman, the historic, not just Christian position, but British position and Western position, then you have to say, well, where then do you go as an issue of principle? And is it discriminatory not to legislate to legalise polygamy, for example? Because you're clearly saying, well, we're going to allow marriage to be redefined in one way, but not in a different way. And on what basis are you saying that? You have to answer that question. How do you, or what do you do if you have a bisexual man who lives with a man and a woman? What do you do in that scenario? And already there has been moves in some European countries to recognise that type of relationship in law. So these are questions which you can't see this in isolation. You have to say, where does this lead on to logically, even if there is no political will at the moment to go there?
Thank you very much. As I say, we're actually quite tight for time, so I'll pass you over to Christian just now. Christian Allard.
Yes, thank you very much for coming, first of all. And I would like to keep on talking about not talking about this subject in isolation. Would the panel agree with me that since the Scottish Government started the conversation in 2011, and since 2011, a lot of other countries have put forward bills about same-sex marriage, and in this unholy relationship in London between the Liberal Democrats and the Conservative, they did so, but they did so in other countries as well in Europe. And I would like to know your views is how will that play with your own organization, with your own churches who are in these countries, and how you see we live in a globalized world now, so people are moving a lot more than they were moving in the past. And how will that conflict in your whole organization, in your whole churches, this difference of legislation between different countries? So there is two questions. It's a question of timing. Do you think the timing in the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament is right to have taken maybe a bit longer than in other legislation in other countries? And how it will affect, if the bill is not going through, how will that affect your own organization and your own churches if the bill has already gone through in other countries?
That, there are very few countries in the world. I think it's about 10 countries. I mean, France has, as you're familiar with, recently. But there are very few countries, and it's a particularly Western phenomenon, actually. And I don't expect that there is going to be large swathes of countries in Africa or the Middle East or Eastern Europe rushing to legalise same-sex marriage in the next 20 years, unless they're forced to do so by the Council of Europe or the European Court of Human Rights, which is a danger for those that are members of the Council of Europe, regardless of national views or democratic mandates. So in terms of the view that this is a progressive trend and that everybody's going to do it eventually, I think that's a very questionable view, to be honest. In terms of my organisation, we're a Scottish organisation and we have no plans to set up a campaign in France, you'll be pleased to know.
Okay. I think maybe I could begin to answer the first question by picking up something that Alan Hamilton said, and that is that really we're here discussing two different things. One is the question whether we support this legislation, and the other is what our position is or will be as agents within that new legislation. And it may very well be that, of course, we all have opinions, and some of us have, as has already been made very clear, either not yet formed an opinion or different opinions, or are still very far away from forming an official opinion through our various governing bodies. And it may be that, therefore, from that point of view, it's actually far too swift a process. Although it may seem very slow, parliamentary procedure may seem very slow in itself, the various denominations represented around here grind even slower. And therefore, to ask not just the first question, but go further and ask the second is far too swift for us. The second of your questions, my understanding, and I ready to be corrected is that in most European countries and in other jurisdictions as well, civil marriage and religious marriage are completely separate from one another. In other words, there are two separate ceremonies. You go to, as it were, the registry office for one, and you go to the church or synagogue or mosque or whatever it might be for the other. And it may very well be that an unintended consequence of all of this is that, in fact, that starts to happen more in this country as well. And therefore, we need to be conscious, first of all, that what happens in all the jurisdictions in the UK is not the same as happens everywhere else, even already as regards what is currently referred to as marriage, picking up that point. And in fact, that it may very well be that following what one might call the European model is actually a way of avoiding some of the problems that are clearly being thrown out around this table.
Christian, do you have
I just wanted to know the other members of the panel, their views on this.
Yes, I would agree that for us, the time is moving too quickly. The timescale is moving too quickly. We need more time to work this one through. I'm not sure where we'll get to in the Episcopal Church and what resolution we'll reach in terms of a relationship to this legislation. But you're quite right to say that we are part of a much wider family of churches, and we're part of various communions of churches as well. And we are, for example, in communion with the church in Sweden, which does celebrate same-sex marriages under the state there. But we're also, in the Anglican communion, part of a worldwide family of churches that includes lots of churches in Africa and other parts of the world for whom this would be complete anathema. And we have responsibilities to them as well. And we have to be careful not to be seen to be going it alone as a church, and we have to respect the fact that the speed we might want to move at wouldn't be the speed that the whole church would want to move at. So I think the implication of your question is right, that we're not autonomous on this in the sense that we would want to respect where our brothers and sisters elsewhere are standing.
Quite interested about the countries you're talking about who will not legislate in that way. Do you think there will be there is an amendment proposed by Equality Network and Transgender Alliance Scotland to allow couples with a civil partnership registered in another country to marry in Scotland? Do you think that will be an influence? That could be a consequences?
I haven't thought that one through in any depth, but I'm sure that might be the case. If one of our churches, for example, were to say, yes, we will happily officiate at same-sex marriages, yeah, I'm sure there will be people then coming from elsewhere, because the thing is that there are many Christians who are gay, and they would want to celebrate their partnership in a sanctified fashion. And if that can be done within the context of a church service somewhere, then they may well seek to go to that somewhere to do it. But whether that somewhere will be the Scottish Episcopal Church or the Church of Scotland or any of our denominations is something that we still have to work through.
Thank you very much. Jim, Edie, do you have any questions you'd like to ask?
Thank you very much. My questions are primarily for the Reverend Hamilton, but I'd welcome views if we have time from the other panel members. You did express some doubt about the opt-in provisions of the proposed legislation, but can I ask you, don't you accept that the bill in and of itself will not compel individual celebrants to perform same-sex marriage, but actually beyond that, it will not actually allow individual celebrants within the Church of Scotland to celebrate same-sex marriage for the very reason that you outlined, which is that there would have to be a very protracted period of debate and discussion before the General Assembly in the Church of Scotland could arrive at a definitive position?
It's not that protracted.
2015 on the issue of
if I could be allowed to complete my answer, Convener, which is simply this: it's not going to be decades; it's going to be a matter of years. And our concern is that if the Church of Scotland generally says no, then we will be challenged under European legislation, and whatever is in the Act, whatever is in the UK Act, whatever is in delegated legislation will unravel. If we say yes, ministers and deacons may, if they choose, celebrate same-sex marriages, then either the denomination or the individual celebrant who says no, or both, will find themselves being challenged under European legislation. I think your question is based upon a red herring. The fact is, if the Church of Scotland even delays, it could find itself being challenged. The point is not whether or not the Scottish Government or indeed the Scottish Parliament wishes to offer protections to the Church of Scotland or indeed any other denomination here. The point is whether these are effective, and that is where there is deep concern.
Very helpful to have that on the record. Thank you.
You can't see this bill in isolation from other legislation. There is an Equality Act which was passed through Westminster. There is the European Convention of Human Rights. And certainly the problem that arose when the issue of adoption was considered by your predecessor committee was that ministers gave lots of assurances that nothing in the bill would force shut down Catholic adoption agencies, and that was technically right, because it wasn't anything in the bill. It was the equality legislation at Westminster that was the problem, which has led to most of them shutting down. And so the same sorts of assurances can be given by ministers this time round in relation to this bill. But the question you, I think, have a moral responsibility to ask yourselves is are these protections robust in terms of an ECHR challenge? And there is already an attempt south of the border to challenge the law down there, which was passed just a few weeks ago, and particularly in relation to the position of the Church of England. So, you know, we expect that a similar challenge will arise, almost certainly, north of the border. So what we would say to you is you need to ensure that not only this bill, but other legislation, as to the extent that you can influence it, is also amended to provide those protections.
Sorry, Mr. Borowski.
Very quickly, following on from that, there is nothing that I'm aware of in the Equality Act that suggests that there should be a hierarchy of grounds of equality. But it's quite clear from looking at the decisions in case law that that has in fact emerged, and that issues about gender and sexuality trump issues about religion. Now, in fact, there may be nothing in the UK Equality Act to that effect. There actually is something in the Scotland Act, and if you look at the Equality Clause in Appendix 5 of the Scotland Act, the way it is worded actually lays down a hierarchy of grounds of which religion comes right at the very end, along with political beliefs. So, if anything, there is the potential for even more of a legal challenge in Scotland than there might be elsewhere in the UK. Somebody referred to earlier, I think it was Gordon, the provision in European law for a margin of appreciation. And I think that really what we should be considering is, as he said at that point in the discussion, whether in fact we should be developing a situation within all the UK jurisdictions in which there is some possibility for clashes of different equality strands to be dealt with reasonably, rather than in terms of one of them simply always being understood to trump another, for whatever reason that has come about.
Jim, do you have one more question?
I have one final question, Convener, if I may. Again, for the Reverend Hamilton, and that was are you aware of individual clergy within the Church of Scotland who are supportive of this legislation, for whom it is a considerable source of personal pain that they are not going to be able to perform same-sex marriage? That is a view that's been expressed to me by clergy within my own constituency. So I speak with some knowledge of this.
I'm interested to know how you know that they're not going to be allowed to conduct same-sex marriages, because I don't know that.
Well, that's the view that's been expressed to me, is that the legislation in and of itself will not allow that to happen, because they are governed by the General Assembly, and the government's intention is not to interfere in the internal affairs of any individual denomination.
Convener, I have really from the outset made it clear that this is a matter that the General Assembly has yet to consider. So how Mr Reedy can reach that conclusion, I struggle, unless he has the gift of prophecy. I don't know.
Well, I think you're misinterpreting and representing the view that I've expressed. I'm expressing the view of my constituents who are clergy within the Church of Scotland and other denominations who have said to me that it is a matter of personal, individual pain that they will not be able to perform same-sex marriage.
I refer to my earlier answer, Convener.
Thank you very much for your questions. Jim, can I pass you over to Marco? He's got a very short question to ask.
Yes or no would be fine. If this was a bill simply to legislate for same-sex civil marriage and leave religious officiation out entirely, would you have the same concerns? Each of you.
Start with Mr. Reverend Hamilton.
Different concerns.
Mr. Macdonald.
We would certainly be concerned because we believe that marriage is between a man and a woman.
That's a yes.
Yeah.
Mr. Borowski.
I would have to take advice from the various strands of the religious strands of the Jewish community, but I suspect we would say that's a completely different question.
Reverend Robertson.
The question doesn't make sense because the state cannot regulate religious marriage. It can only regulate civil marriage. So the obvious answer to that would be I'd share the same concerns. Mostly that the state thinks that it can regulate religious marriage. The state has no right.
Bishop Arms.
Yes, the concerns will be different. But clearly we're concerned about society at large, not just about what happens within the confines of our own churches.
Can I thank you all for your contributions? I'll now suspend the meeting to allow our second panel of witnesses to take their seat. And thank you once again for coming along. Can I welcome our second panel of witnesses? And can I ask you all to start by introducing yourself? And can I pass you to Louise?
Hi, I'm Louise Cameron and I'm the Vice Chair of the Scottish Youth Parliament.
I'm Reverend David Coleman. I'm here in my capacity as the convener of the Church and Society Committee of the National Synod of Scotland of the United Reformed Church.
I'm Ross Wright from the Humanist Society. I'm a celebrant and the spokesperson on equal marriage.
Good morning, I'm Mark Bevan from Amnesty International.
Morning, and can I now pass you over to John Mason? Would you like to start the questions, John? Yes.
That was a surprise. Thanks so much, and thanks for your contributions. I mean, could I ask perhaps the Scottish Youth Parliament paper? It was interesting. I was reading it out of interest. I mean, once or twice in your submission, you say, for example, we are firmly of the belief that two people in love should be allowed to demonstrate their love and commitment to each other in a way that reflects their personal feelings for each other. Can I ask why you chose the number 2? Because culturally, in many parts of the world in the past, and still some in the present, it's perfectly acceptable to have 3 people in a marriage, as long as, obviously, everybody's willing to go in. So can I ask why you chose 2?
Well, we firmly believe that a marriage is between 2 people. Polygamy is not equal, and usually it's very against the woman. It's not an equal relationship, and we believe that between 2 people, it can be an equal relationship.
So even if all 3 were willing to go into it and loved each other and wanted to, you would be against that?
Yeah, that's not what we're fighting for. We're fighting for 2 people who love each other and getting married.
Okay, thank you. The Humanist Society, I don't know if you were in for the previous session, but I did ask the Church of Scotland if they thought they were privileged, as you were suggesting, and they seemed to be a bit vague about that. Could you clarify for us why you think they're in a privileged position?
In law, they're the only people who are, as of right, allowed to marry people. Everybody else has to be approved, but they are, as of right, allowed to marry people. And that also creates another confusion within the bill that requires an additional amendment about deacons. If they were in the same clause as everybody else, they could approve whoever they wanted. And it's because they have this special privilege, as of right to marry, that this other consequence of the deacon's clause has to come in. So obviously, before an equality committee, we advocate that everybody should be treated equally, and because it's not an established church, there is no basis for that special privilege.
Okay, thank you. In your submission, you say it is unthinkable a public official carrying out a public service be allowed to discriminate on the grounds of sexuality, sexual orientation. However, we do have other examples where, although people work for the public sector, they do things in different ways, and the obvious one is abortion, that individual employees are allowed to opt out of being involved in abortion. I don't know if you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it has been suggested that that is a possible model for the future, that although the state pays everybody and provides services, you would allow a bit of movement for individual conscience.
Abortion is a fundamentally different thing from 2 people getting married. Nobody's dying. It's to put the 2 together, I think, is ridiculous. However, if we turn it on its head, and I always think it's useful to turn things on their head to see, would it be reasonable for me as an atheist, as I think somebody alluded to, me as an atheist registrar, to not to marry somebody if I knew them to be religious? Now, that would be unthinkable. So why, in uniquely this situation with sexuality, we're making this special provision? And it seems that if the opinion is of MSPs that lesbian and gay people should be regarded as equal, then everybody is equal. And there's no hierarchy of equality. And I would fight equally for the privilege of people to believe what they believe, for their religion. All of these things are equal.
Would you accept that people can be of equal value, but people would disagree as to that some behaviour is wrong, and that people would draw a distinction between having a sexual orientation and actually what your sexual activity was.
I think that's another situation which is not logical. It's like saying somebody who's black, but they just don't show their skin so nobody knows they're different. It's a fundamental part of that individual, and expressing sexuality and being gay is the same thing.
Okay. I mean, I'm assuming you'd be against having faith in faith schools at all, because, I mean, faith schools, again, is an example where the state provides education in different ways, either in faith schools or non-faith schools.
Unfortunately, I'm not here to debate about faith education, and I'm not an expert on it. So,
yes. Well, I accept that, but my point is that you're not happy with the state providing funds and doing services in different ways. You want everything to be exactly the same.
If that's the way that the state currently agrees that things should be managed, we would prefer it to be different, but we're not campaigning for that actively in this bill.
That's fine just now, thanks.
Thank you. Can I now ask John Finney to ask some questions?
Thank you, Convener. I've got some questions for Mr. Wright and then Mr. Bevan. Mr. Wright, in relation to your submission, you talk about gender recognition certificates. Could you outline your position on that and say why you hold that position, please? If it maybe helps, the submission here is that you strongly support the ability of transgender person to remain married when obtaining a gender recognition.
Yes, so that if within a marriage between a man and a woman, one of them decides to change gender, they don't need to get divorced to then. Yes, they don't need to get divorced to then remarry as a single, an opposite-sex couple, a same-sex couple rather.
Okay, moving on to the issue of freedom of speech. You say, when, and I quote here from the submission, when these laws were framed, and this was were framed, the lawmakers did not consider enshrining in law special rights for those opposed to treating women, minority ethnic people, or disabled people equally. Is marriage not different?
I don't see it as different, and the position of the Humanist Society is that it's not different, in that treating somebody's sexuality, it seems to be, because it's sexuality, we seem to be getting into a real state over it and treating it so differently from race or gender. And it's puzzling to me why this special provision is being made to bend over backwards to allow people, and of course they will still have the right to disagree, they will still have the right to say what they want about it. But what we are simply arguing for is the right for people who want to have a same-sex marriage.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Bevan, we've heard a lot of rights, and Amnesty will have experience of dealing with situations where, if you like, there are competing rights. Can you comment on how that you think that should be dealt with in relation to legislation?
The fundamental position of Amnesty International is reflected in something called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that it is universal is the most important thing about it, and we wouldn't see a conflict in rights here at all. So I don't know, Mr. Finney, if you're referring to our belief that same-sex marriage should be allowed in law and equality, set against, as some have argued, the opportunity for religious celebrants to refuse to marry. We don't see those two things in conflict at all. The freedom to practice a religion is not in conflict with the freedom to marry on an equal basis as everybody else in the community.
Can you comment about what people would see as protections afforded by this legislation with regard to religious celebrants?
Well, having reviewed the proposals in the bill, we see no issue there at all, and the Lord Advocate's made his position very clear as well.
Very much indeed.
Can I bring Marco in on a supplementary?
Yes, to Mr. Bevan. You just referred to freedom to practice there as an organisation that is active in many countries and is very strong on freedom to practice religious persecution around the world. Do you consider that there is an issue with freedom to practice for those faiths, including those sitting next to you, who are not currently free to practice their view of same-sex of marriage, which includes performing them for same-sex couples?
sorry, you're able to clarify your question?
Sorry, in terms of freedom to practice, which is an important human right.
Absolutely.
Do you think there is a problem that many faiths in Scotland that wish to perform same-sex marriages to practice their faith that way are currently forbidden from doing so?
Absolutely.
Fair enough.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. Can we pass you over to Siobhan now? Thank you.
Mr. Wright, just in evidence there, you spoke about you would defend anyone's right to practice their beliefs solely on this bill at the moment, but you would advocate for other beliefs. But isn't it the case when you say that you don't understand the opposing view, it's because you may not understand the religious body or you don't want to understand the religious body or belief? Would that be something you recognise or not?
No, I understand what the people are coming from, but what we need to recognise if we're going to have a secular modern democracy, which we would advocate, is that you should be able to frame laws which allow both to coexist. And that's why we strongly support the law, because it strongly supports the right of people like ourselves who wish to conduct those marriages and protects those who do not wish to. One point I would like to make about the conscience clauses, and I think it was alluded to maybe by Mr. Eadie, was that it works only one way, in that people whose organisations have opted in, for example, a Humanist, could themselves refuse to do marriages, which would be fair enough. However, those opted out organisations, the freedom of conscience for those individuals, for example, a Catholic priest or a minister of the Church of Scotland, would not be respected. So conscience needs to be looked at from both directions.
Okay. It won't come as a surprise to anybody, but I'm going to ask the same question about the equality impact assessment and your views on that, because, as I said, it has been conducted with the bill that says that the guarantees that we're told, the robust guarantees we're told are there, may not be enacted. Do you have a view on that, and do you think they can be?
Could I ask Reverend Coleman to start?
Yes. Can you just clarify which guarantees you mean?
Yes, so again, no celebrant will have to perform same-sex marriage if they don't wish. Right. The protection for education, the various other freedoms, again, of expression, speech,
right.
Are all supposed to be contained in the bill.
Yes.
Others, so there's both sides of the argument. One part of the argument are saying, that's fine, we're content with that because we don't wish to see religious bodies being forced, the term, into doing that, and therefore we believe that the principles contained in the bill are robust. However, the opposing view is that they're not and can be challenged, and the equality impact assessment casts some doubt on that, so I just wondered your own opinions.
Right. We've obviously been following this intently over the last couple of years, and we have become convinced that the guarantees contained within the bill are adequate. From one point of view, they may even seem excessive, but maybe that's sufficient to guarantee that they are there and that no one is forced to engage in something which they are spiritually disinclined to do. So, as we've said before, we are in support of things because we believe the guarantees are there both to enable same-sex marriages to happen and to protect those who wish not to be a party to that, while at the same time, from a public order point of view, not being able to bully those who wish to go ahead out of that.
To comment?
The Scottish Youth Parliament, when we were campaigning for Love Equally, we were always very clear that we believed that religious bodies who didn't want to take part in doing same-sex marriages shouldn't be forced into doing them. But the religious bodies that feel like they wish to do it should have the choice to conduct the marriages.
John would like to come in.
Supplementary, if I may, thanks, Convener. Yeah, it was the point you just made to my colleague, and in your written evidence, it talked about protections being more than adequate, sorry, Mr. Coleman, and freedom of speech is more than safeguarded, leaning heavily in the direction of the protection of those opposed. So do you feel actually you'd like to see the proposed bill amended to kind of weaken it or make it more level?
No. within the United Reformed Church, we greatly respect individual conscience and opinion, and that's, you know, we try and be, and this is why we haven't expressed an opinion as a denomination, because we know we contain people with different views. Looking at, having followed the process over the last 2 years, it seems that the protections are so thorough that if you are looking at total equality, this does not give it. But on the other hand, I think at the end of the day, when you get a couple coming and asking to be married, it will make no difference to them whatsoever. And if it reassures those who are opposed, then let's go with it. We certainly are not advocating that those protections be weakened, merely noting that they bring into effect a state of inequality, but it's perhaps a necessary one to enable equality to happen.
It was just on the Scottish Youth Parliament submission, and thank you very much for that. It was just a bit of clarification, if you don't mind, with certain points that were made. And so you speak about the consultation that happened in 42,804 responses were achieved from young people. How were they collated? How was it advertised, the consultation?
Well, we have MSYPs in each constituencies and representing voluntary organisations, and they went out and consulted with young people on the manifesto, on the questions that are in the manifesto.
How did they engage with the young people? Was it schools? Was it all schools? Was it colleges? Was it hosting public events? It's just to get a bit of clarification.
Well, because we've got such a variety of people in the Scottish Youth Parliament, we have people representing schools, we have people representing colleges and universities, and everyone has their own ways of approaching people. For me personally, when I go and consult, I do it through my school, but I know for other people who aren't in school, it can be a difficulty to go into schools and consult. So people do it for what's suitable to them. So I think that works even better because you get a wider range of opinions, and it's not just a school group targeted. You're targeting all ranges of ages.
So just to be clear, and I'm only doing it because I had to go through a consultation yesterday on a separate committee, and we were trying to get, if it's robust or not. So it's clearly trying to get how you got to the 42,804. So is it conversations that you're having with people on the account, or was it specific forums that people filled out, or was it an online survey? Did that happen?
I didn't personally do it, so I can't get back to you on that because I wasn't a member at that time. But no, I'm sorry, I can get back to you on that. But
just because obviously the submission is based solely on this consultation that's taken place with 42,804 responses to it, and seemingly it's the priority of young people. Now, if it is, and I'm not disputing that that's the case, I need to know how that was arrived at. So, for instance, youth unemployment may be a priority for young people. How do we arrive at what the priority was?
Well, we actually voted on this as our national campaign with the Youth Parliament, and it was picked over issues like youth unemployment and transport. And it's something that my generation feels strongly about, and we don't tolerate bullying and we don't tolerate inequality. We're a generation that believes in fairness, and I think that that's why young people are back in this bill, because it's important to young people. It's something we don't believe that the inequality should stand in society anymore.
No, I fully accept where you're coming from. It's just trying to get to how this number was collated. So if you could provide more information to the committee, I think that would be helpful in writing. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you, and I'll pass over to Marco to ask questions now.
Thank you. As organisations that are not LGBT organisations, or indeed, in the case of Ms. Bevan, Ms. Cameron, not ones that perform marriage either, I think you're the only two representatives of such groups actually to have come here other than Scotland for Marriage. Why, if you were to sum up why you had made this an issue for your organisation, what would you say?
Well, I think that people of my age, they believe that two people who love each other should have the right to get married, and to the Scottish Youth Parliament, same-sex relationships are just as important as mixed-sex relationships. We're not going to discriminate against people by their sexual orientation, and we believe everyone should have the right to get married, whether they're mixed-sex relationships or same-sex relationships, they should have the same right.
Mr. Bevan?
our position would come, as you would expect, from a general promotion of human rights. So the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights makes it very clear that equal marriage should be available to all. So there's a fundamental campaigning issue for us there. We also see over a decade of research how intolerance of LGBT people across the world has led to very significant hate crime. That's as present in Scotland today as it is in far-flung places such as Russia. So in Arbroath earlier on this week, there was a woman very badly mistreated in a public park because of her sexuality. When we look more broadly across the world, we see legislation allowing permissive attitude in relation to hate crime. So we see people being executed by the state as a result of practicing their sexual behavior. We see people being tortured. We see limitations on demonstrations and movements in Turkey, Russia, Albania, Latvia, so on. When we compare what the Scottish Parliament, to bring it home, has done in the past, it's been a Parliament which is founded on equality. There is inequality in law in relation to marriage at the moment, and if as successive parliaments have done, if this Parliament wants to take action and take a lead in relation to promoting equality and universal human rights, then this is a bill which needs to be passed. And there is a tension on Scotland at the moment for a number of reasons, including because Scotland has taken a strong position in relation to a number of human rights. And if I could find the right piece of paper and quote to you from Ban Ki-moon, UN Secretary General, earlier on this year, it was saying to lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender people, let me say to you, you are not alone. Your struggle for an end to violence and discrimination is a shared struggle. Any attack on you is an attack on the universal values of the United Nations, and I call upon all countries to stand with you. That's an attack on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a founding convention that supports a fair and civilized society.
To follow on from that, some people have cited both the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the ECHR's conferring of a right to marry in terms of a man and a woman as being an argument against same-sex marriage. How would you respond to that?
The Universal Declaration and I think more personally the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, but also the European Convention, are all written as what we would refer to as live instruments. So they are not written at a point in time which is fixed and frozen in that time. They're designed in order to be interpreted in the light of contemporary society. And again, if I may quote to you, the concept of family is so varied across cultures there can be no standard definition. So that's the United Nations Human Rights Committee, which goes on to say, despite this and all arguments in relation to marriage, all arguments place an essential value on the principle of non-discrimination at the fore of the discussion about family, all types of family and relationships.
Ms. Cameron, can you, to go to a slightly different topic, can you tell me what it's like these days to be at school and be gay?
Well, I don't think for my generation it's an issue seeing someone as gay. It's just something that's accepted now. There's nothing wrong with being gay. It's just something that's kind of accepted. Bullying, it's a big issue, homophobic bullying as well. I mean, 71% thought that there should be like more education on the stigma that follows LGBT, and homophobic bullying is really common in schools. 69% of people have experienced it. But in my personal experience, my school personally, it's not something that's a big deal. Young people are kind of accepted as being gay. It's all right. For my generation, you know, they don't think that being LGBT is a problem.
Can I ask then, there's a proposal to change the age for gender recognition, which currently stands at 18 to 16. this is the legal recognition of the changes in the gender of habitual life, rather than anything else. Is that something the Youth Parliament has thought of, and do you have a position on it?
I'm sorry, I'm not very sure on that.
Okay.
I can get back to you.
Fair enough. And the last one I have really and I'd be keen to actually get everyone's views on this, although it comes from the Amnesty submission to the Scottish Government consultation. It said, denial of equal civil recognition of same-sex relationships prevents many people from accessing a range of other rights and stigmatises those relationships in ways that can fuel discrimination. This was the reason why civil partnerships were not adequate. Would you, presumably Amnesty would agree with that, would the others?
Rev Coleman?
We're talking civil here. We did discuss these issues within the committee, and certainly we felt that if something is offered by the state, it should be offered to all without exception. If there is an agent of the state, registrar or whatever, who has a conscientious problem, then that is the problem, if you like, of the state. And somebody should be found without hindrance to or inconvenience to those who are applying, who can conduct what's the ceremony that's required.
Mr. Wright?
Well, our concept of civil partnerships was it was a nod to equality and a step in the right direction. But it's like Rosa Parks in America when she could get on the bus. But we see equal civil partnerships, which we also would like, and equal marriage as the fundamental step of people being able to choose which seat they sit on the bus.
Just compared the situation to racism, how would you come back at the comment that was made by, I think, the person that sat in that seat in the last panel, that if you view this as an issue equated to racism, how can you justify allowing denominations to choose to be essentially racist?
It's an accommodation, certainly, as my colleague here said, we're prepared to concede, to give even more freedom to discriminate. Now, it is giving freedom to discriminate, yes, which we're not happy with, but for the sake of getting this bill passed, we will concede it. The other point which I'd like to make about the marriages is that people who are not registrars are given the right to conduct marriages, not the duty to conduct marriages. And it's very important to realise. And because of that, it's a mystery to me why we even need the opt-out or opt-in clauses. But they are an additional part. Anybody comes to me to ask me to marry them, I don't need to. I don't need to give a reason. I could be washing my hair. I could be busy that day. There's no reason for me to give why I won't marry somebody.
Alex would like to come in a supplementary, and then John Mason.
Just one point that was made there by Ross Wright a moment ago, and I'd like to ask a short question on it. You seem to express the view that the bill is imperfect, but you see it as being an improvement. In that respect, do you see this bill as being an end in itself, or simply one more step along the way?
In respect of
the progress of the rights of homosexuals, for example?
I would see it as the end point, and that the final legal hurdle to equality has been reached. Whether other organisations, for example, the churches and so forth, wish to later adapt, that's up to them. That's their choice, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you.
John?
Yes, Mr. Wright, it was the point that you just made just now about this was, I think, permissive legislation. It's not compulsory. And however, we raised this last week as well. I mean, the Catholic adoption agencies came in there as well, because originally they were permitted to place children with same-sex couples, but it wasn't compulsory. But that has then moved quite quickly to it becoming compulsory, and then they have to close down. So do you think the same might happen here?
Well, my understanding of the situation, and I'm not fully aware of it, but what is that they could have maintained and stayed open. It was their choice to close down rather than treat people equally. That was their choice. Nobody forced them to close down. So it was their choice, their conscience that chose them to do that. I would strongly advocate there should be no compulsion ever for people to conduct same-sex marriages. And I think all the provisions that are there, even the existing law, as far as I read it, states that I am not compelled to marry anybody.
So in the same way, the churches would have the free choice to either close down or maybe do same-sex marriages
Well,
in
in
future.
fact, it was interesting that our colleague from the Church of Scotland, who was so concerned that there may be a threat, and that might be a solution, if they are so concerned that they might be threatened, they might choose to get out of the civil marriage business, and therefore they would conduct presumably some kind of blessing or to give it the emotional and religious status that they require for their marriages.
And we'll move on to Alex Johnson for some questions.
I don't have a huge number of questions. There's one very specific one before I take up a general point, and it relates to something, before I forget, that Mark Bevan said. You were describing the live definition and the wide range of family relationships that exist across the world and how it's difficult to define. When you said that, my instant reaction was to want to ask, do you therefore take the view that all definitions should be equally applicable everywhere?
Tricky question. I think I'd want to come back to you on that, because I think it's important that we look at the context in which the setting for family exists. So we have a kind of cultural norm, if you like, which this bill clearly is challenging, given the strength of feeling about it. The guidance we get from the international law is that we should take a progressive view, generally speaking, of what a family relationship should consist of, and the guiding principle behind that should be about equality. So I think to bring a direct relevance to this bill from your question, from my perspective, would be to state what I think is the obvious, that the bill reduces, should it pass, an inequality which is currently existing in the context of forms of family relationships and marriage which are currently taking place in Scotland today.
Thank you. If there's any additional information on that, I'd be delighted to have it. The main subject I want to discuss, and it need only be brief, because my object here is to ensure that I ask you the same question that I asked the last panel. And looking at the written evidence that the last panel provided, most, if not all, talked about the role of marriage within broader society. And the question I asked was that whether they saw marriage as having a role in providing stability in broader society as a basis for family, for rearing children, and for providing social stability across society. Do you have views on the role of marriage within that? And do you believe this change in the law will weaken the role of marriage in other aspects of society?
Again, having looked through things, when we have discussions within the Synod of Scotland, certainly, we have started by trying to come to, as far as possible, come to a mind as what people in differing positions regard as essential to marriage. The commitment, the respect, the equality. And so I think it's likely that people, again, with differing opinions, would also say that marriage itself is beneficial to and a stabilizing factor in society. The discussion has been on how you define marriage, not that whether marriage itself is a good thing. We also certainly within the committee were very much of a mind that the introduction of same-sex marriage would not have any impact whatsoever on opposite-sex marriage.
I do find it puzzling that when the opponents of the bill suggest this, particularly because same-sex couples, whether you like it or not, do have children, be it by adoption, by surrogacy and so forth. And it logically follows that if you believe that marriage is good for children, it must logically follow that you must support marriage for same-sex couples with children. It is incoherent to argue both ways. if children deserve the protection of marriage, then all children deserve that protection. That's our point of view. But one other thing I'd just like to bring up about marriage in general in Scotland, and we can do as many surveys as we like and so forth, but it's really important to realise that the majority of marriages in Scotland now are not religious. And it has been that way for some time. So although the religious perspective is worthwhile for those who have a religious faith, part of the reason I'm here is to argue for those millions of people who do not share a religious faith and actually share the legal definition, which is defined in marriage, which is a private contract between two individuals. And you can dress it up with as much philosophy as you like, but that's what the legal definition of a marriage is.
Mark Bevan.
Thank you. We don't take a view on marriage being a preferable status in terms of societal cohesion, which I think was at the heart of what you were saying. That's not a human rights issue. But we take a strong view on where marriage and forms of marriage exist, where they are not equally applied, then that's contrary to societal cohesion. And if I may, there was a question asked earlier on about the views of young people in relation to this and the views of people in school. There was a 3-country survey done last year: Finland, the United Kingdom, I think it was France. And they looked at suicide rates amongst children and young people and what were the causes of the higher suicide rates. And in the United Kingdom in particular, young gay people were at a very much higher risk of suicide than many other categories. So, and I think for the Parliament not to pass a bill which enables that equality really contributes to a status in which we have this second-class position of civil partnerships versus marriage.
Siobhan would like to come in on that, and then Louise.
Mr Bevan, you've said this twice now and given examples of when homophobia exists and what it means. In last week's evidence, I suggested to Stonewall, which they agreed with, obviously, that those who oppose this bill are not homophobic, and therefore the position that you take of the suicide rates, people would be appalled at the suicide rates as well, those people who oppose this bill. So when we're talking about the bill, we're not talking about people who are homophobic. We're saying they oppose this bill for various reasons, not solely those reasons. I'm sure there are homophobic people who oppose the bill as well. I'm not suggesting for one moment they aren't, but the vast majority wouldn't be. And I don't think it's helpful to the argument to equate those things. I wonder your opinion on that.
Yeah, I think the bill provides an opportunity to deliver a more equal society. That's something which, you know, as I've said, successive parliaments have tried to deliver. I think an action that a parliament can take to foster greater tolerance, understanding and respect for other people will create a more equal society. And you're quite right, that's not about homophobia or not homophobia, it's about equality. It's about all people being treated the same.
Louise.
To come back on that point, in the survey that LGBT Youth Scotland conducted, 10% of people who have been homophobically bullied because of homophobia left school. Now, should we be encouraging a Scotland where people are like leaving school because there's not the support for them to be, you know, no one's supporting them against homophobic bullying? I don't think at all that it's going to weaken the role of marriage in Scotland. Marriage is very personal to each person, and it's not going to make a difference to people of other beliefs if people are having same-sex marriage, in my opinion.
Sorry, I had a direct question there. If I could respond to that. Yeah, I don't think anybody's suggesting for one moment that we shouldn't tackle those people who have to leave school because of homophobic bullying. The suggestion is that this isn't what this bill's about, and so you're equating two things. I understand some people may think they're linked, and of course, you know, I'm not opposing that view, but what I'm saying is to use those stats aren't necessarily the same as this bill. So I think we equate two things. Similarly, to get to equality, I understand that it's a huge thing, and therefore, you know, the bullying starts if you do not believe in equality. But I think the stats that are being used aren't helpful when we're talking about the principles of the bill. And again, how how the bill will impact on other religions, I don't think, as far as I'm aware, and of course you're going to clarify, if indeed those who were surveyed were asked that specific question about how it will impact on religions, and actually how many religious bodies or faith schools were asked about that when you conducted the survey?
I'm not suggesting that like there's a direct link between homophobic bullying and same-sex marriage, but it's going to make for a more tolerant Scotland if you do have same-sex marriage, and if it's being taught about in school in terms of like a stable relationship and rights that people have in Scotland, it's going to make people more tolerant to, you know, homophobic same-sex relationships.
Reverend Coleman.
Might I return to Mr. Allard's question about the stability of society and marriage, just for a moment? Sorry. All right, Mr. Johnson. Again, within the conversations we've had over the last couple of years, the United Reformed Church Synod of Scotland can have no objection to marriage on the basis, or same-sex marriage, on the basis that it will not result in the conception of children. We're of the view, and I think this is a general consensus, that the nature of marriage is primarily the fellowship of the couple, and children are an additional blessing added to that. Though, again, speaking as a parent, my nurture of my children was not exhausted by donating one cell. The nurture of children is something which goes on throughout people's lives, and marriage can add to the stability of society by providing a place for that.
Anyone else like to comment? No? Marco would like to come in a supplementary.
Just following on from that, Ms. Coleman, are you aware of the submissions that have come in from all the organisations, or is that something you've not had time to look at? I was basically wanting to ask, the kinds of things that have been talked about as changes to education linked to this bill from those who oppose the bill, things like the editing of what textbooks might be available, the removal of discussion of marriage in same-sex terms from many sections of the classroom, that sort of thing. Do you think that's, if that was enacted, would that make homophobic bullying better or worse?
I think it would make young people more tolerant to same-sex relationships. If you're introducing it in a classroom and you're giving a teacher who's got a non-biased view, who's teaching about it,
Do you maybe one of the other witnesses would like to contribute?
Well, I certainly would say that within the classroom setting, that teachers are there to teach and they're there to educate. So it should really be about facilitating discussion if these are the discussions the children want to have, and not to express a view one way or the other, because that's not a teacher's job. I was privileged to have a modern studies teacher who, try as I may, I never found out what his political affiliations were. And that's the kind of teaching model I would like to see around sexuality and discussion of these kinds.
Reverend Coleman.
Again, based on our discussions, we certainly felt that what is taught in schools should not introduce the note of controversy which would be intimidating to children in a same-sex family. So if this becomes law, then it's presented in the neutral sort of way that Mr. Wright just described, rather than that it's over in a corner as something furtive and secret.
Mr. Bevan.
Like Amnesty International and UNICEF produce a lot of information for schools on education around human rights issues. Some of those will be controversial based upon the views of the families of the children that attend those schools. Nonetheless, if we want a more tolerant society, then it's important that we both understand ourselves and we have knowledge and information provided by teachers, the facts, and we have knowledge and understanding of the ways that other people live around us.
Okay, thank you. Louise.
I mean, teachers have a responsibility to be professional, and they should believe in their own personal opinions at the classroom door as it is. I could go into a classroom and a teacher could say to me, right, you have to vote against Scottish independence. It's just not right. They shouldn't be biased towards this topic. It should be about what's right in society and what's the law?
Thank you. And we'll now move on to Christian.
Thank you very much, Convener. I would like to ask a couple of questions. First of all, the question about the amendment that the Equality Network and Transgender Alliance Scotland has put forward to allow couples with a civil partnership registered in another country to marry in Scotland. You can answer yes or no. You can maybe elaborate on this and telling us about the consequences that such amendment could have.
We would support that civil partnerships should be able to marry in this country.
As far as I can tell, we would also support that.
Mr. Bevan.
Yeah, I would agree. And in fact, I think the European Court produced some evidence on this just earlier in the week and produced a position which would agree with that position too.
Yeah.
Would support as well. Thanks very much, to be brief. Second of all, I would like to ask you about the process of what happened in this country, what happened in other countries, and what happening as well in England and Wales. It's the process, the timing of how we come up to this bill. I know you come up to this committee. Do you think that it's been enough time since 2011? What are your views on the consultation that the Scottish Government brought forward? And on the other side of the bill, if the bill is accepted, what do you think about the review that the Scottish Government has said it would like to see? And will that maybe answer some of the concerns you have, or churches have as well, and will be answer all those concerns maybe in a year's time or after the bill is passed, if it's passed?
Bevan Coleman.
Well, our view is that things certainly have not been rushed. The consultations have been thorough, not to say repetitive. So, you know, we don't see there is any cause for further delay or further consultation. We know where people stand. Anyone with eyes and ears or ways of absorbing information knows where people stand. So we are content with the timetable and the care that's taken, particularly with protecting those who are opposed.
Louise would like to contribute.
I mean, every time young people have been consulted in this, 2/3 to 3/4 have agreed that, you know, it should be, same-sex marriage should be allowed in this country. And I think that's enough evidence to say that, you know, it's got enough backing in this. And it's not gone too quickly because we have all the support there. I completely agree when he says it's repetitive. You're getting the same answers over and over again, that your country's for this.
Are you saying that we shouldn't have a review after the bill is passed, if it's passed? You know, the Scottish Government has intended to have a review of the bill once it's passed, if it's passed. Do you think we should have such a review, or do you think that it should be shortened and we shouldn't have such a review?
I think it's a good idea to have a review because you have to be thorough with your, you know, your policy.
First of all, to be honest, I didn't realise that there was a planned review. The review I was aware of was looking at civil partnership legislation, so we would fully support that. But just to take slightly from Louise's point about majorities and numbers, that really equality is not about numbers. And it doesn't matter, even if 90% of people are against it. If a law benefits some people and there is no demonstrable harm to other people, then the law should be passed. And the problem of rehearsing all of these arguments again and again is that the opponents have not demonstrated a shred of evidence of how any demonstrable harm could take place, nor any demonstrable harm from any other country where this already has happened. So it's not about numbers, it's about, is this going to benefit some people? Is it going to be detriment to anybody? And those questions have been resoundingly sorted out. So I think we should move with the speed we're going. As you say, everything has been examined very thoroughly and there's no reason to not pass the bill.
Could you clarify this? What about review? I mean, all legislation's reviewed, I think.
Civil partnerships, it's been reviewed.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Can I pass you on to Siobhan now?
Yeah, and Mr. Wright, I think you've answered this question, so the other panel members, although feel free to comment. Obviously, the consultation, and there were 2 consultations, but the majority, I believe, evidence that have been provided to the committee, were against proposals for the bill. So can you see of any other bill in the Parliament that, given the extensive consultation, as was said twice, and been put to the public, where the majority say they're not in favour coming to a committee as fast as it has done and going through Parliament as fast as it is doing? Do you agree that that's acceptable?
I agree it's acceptable because, first of all, I'm sure you all realise that consultation is not a referendum. But if it were a referendum, then there'd be challenges to it on the accounts of electoral law. Because the questions that were asked for all of these postcards were sent in was one question: do you disagree? If it had allowed 2 questions, do you agree or disagree, then we could start discussing this. But all of the submissions which were against were in one direction. Whereas, for example, with the Equality Network, it was fair to say that they did allow dissent in their submissions.
Well, they know or that. I mean, maybe the majority, but I wouldn't say all of them.
No, the vast majority.
Yeah, but not all of them.
Not all.
You accept that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Would any other witnesses like to comment? Reverend Coleman.
On timing, I think I noted in what we handed in on paper that people are already marrying. So this whole discussion is not about whether people are marrying, but whether the church and, from your point of view, the state recognises that people are entering into a committed lifelong relationship with the aspiration that it's lifelong. And it was, again, something that came out of the discussions that we had, that we finally had to take seriously what everyone had been taught in college, that the people who marry are the couple. And the state or the churches recognise or don't recognise that.
EDM.
We've heard evidence in the earlier session from witnesses that they have a number of the religious denominations, principally the Church of Scotland, but others, have concerns about the robustness of the protections within the legislation and the opt-in provision. Is that something that your denomination, Reverend Coleman, discussed, and do you share those reservations?
We've discussed it at great length and been convinced that the protections are very robust indeed.
Say a little bit more about that, please.
Well, we looked at it, we took legal advice from people within the church and with it. We spoke to civil servants working for the Scottish Parliament. We interrogated this matter as far as we could, and every time the answer we came back was that it was safe to oppose same-sex marriage and safe to be in favour of it. Of course, there have been legal opinions, but we wonder sometimes if it is the case that he who pays the piper calls the tune and expects everybody else to dance to it. You look at where it's coming from, the legal opinion, and you maybe judge it that way.
Mr. Macdonald in the earlier session made reference to the Faculty of Advocates, I think, and there's been the view expressed that this is something that could be subject to a legal challenge. Can you comment on that, Reverend Coleman?
I'm not a lawyer, but as I say, we have been taking legal advice, and so far as we can tell, with our work within the church, we have to keep on saying, do not be afraid. That phrase that comes in the Bible so many hundreds of times. Wherever you stand, do not be afraid.
Can I ask you as well, the United Reformed Church, as I understand it, is a mainstream Christian denomination within the Reformed tradition. So to that extent, you're similar to the Church of Scotland. Another similarity would be that there's a range of views contained within your denomination. But despite those two things, you've come to a different conclusion, and you welcome the legislation. And how soon would your individual celebrants who are in favour of same-sex marriage be able to perform marriage if the legislation is passed?
I can tell you for a fact there are people who would wish to register as celebrants as soon as it is legally possible to do so, and some who definitely would never register. That's the nature of the church, that it contains a diversity of opinion, and we support the bill because it is permissive and not prescriptive. And we have, if you like, the endorsement of the Scottish Synod when we asked a gathering about that is the way that we proceed.
Would any of the other witnesses like to comment?
I think it was a telling point when the opposition spokespeople were asked about what they would like to see to make it robust. And nobody could come up with anything that would make it robust enough for them. And I think it really reflects a fear which, in our opinion, is unfounded, but it is a fear that they are in some way being victimised. But the evidence suggests that the bill is robust from everything that I've seen, that it can't be legally challenged. And the interesting point which came out at the end from the Church of Scotland representative is if they ultimately feel that they are going to be forced into it, they have the option, if they want, again, it's their choice, to opt out and then do blessings for people who have had a civil marriage.
Mr. Bevan.
I think there are 7 countries in the Council of Europe who've already progressed legislation of this nature, and I did check with our lawyers yesterday. We're not aware of any issue in relation to the courts from those countries who have had this legislation in place for quite some time.
Okay, thank you. We do have some spare time. Marco would like to come in. If any other members like to ask in, let me know.
A very straightforward question. Do any of you believe that having children is a central purpose of marriage?
No.
We have to say no, because, as I said before, we believe the marriage is primarily the fellowship of the couple, though in marriage seen collectively as a social institution and a social good, certainly marriage greatly adds to the stability and to the benefit of children, taking marriage understood as quite widely.
To my earlier point, I just would reiterate that if the opponents believe that marriage is good for children, then it seems logical for all of those people who have children, they should be able to get married. But just one point I'd just like to make. All of this discussion has focused around all the technicalities and the legalities of it. But I'd just like to recount a small story about a situation I was placed in. And it was a ceremony I was conducting on a beautiful beach. I don't know if you know Tyningham Beach near North Berwick. Beautiful. There was the marquee there. Everybody was wearing their finery. It was a beautiful day. Everybody was so happy. Kids were running about mad. And the mothers-in-law had their biggest hats on. It was a splendid day. And it was only marred because when the bridal party appeared, which was 2 brides, I could not say the words that everybody else at that gathering were saying, which was marriage. And I had to explain to them from the very first meeting, which was very painful for me, that I cannot say these words. I will be prosecuted if I infer that I'm marrying you. But every single person there, all of the in-laws, the outlaws, Auntie Jeannie and all saw that as marriage. And that's the emotional impact of this bill.
Bevan, would you like to comment?
Amnesty wouldn't take a position in relation to your question. Our position would be fundamentally based in the inequality which exists currently. And the Parliament has the opportunity to pass a piece of legislation which addresses an inequality, or it can decide not to. It can lean towards the European mainstream on human rights, or it cannot.
Presumably Amnesty would think that since there's a variety of types of family and they all deserve equal respect, that the types of family that we see in this society of a one man, one woman, no children, is a valid marriage.
Absolutely.
Louise.
Well, I mean, everyone's relationship's personal to them and everyone's marriage is personal to them. Like, what are you going to do for people who are infertile? They can't have children. A child is not, you know, it doesn't define a marriage. A marriage is like, it's between 2 people who love each other, and it should be personal to them. And if some people won't want to have children, it's the individual relationship's choice.
Thank you very much. Do any of the witnesses have anything else they'd like to comment on? Reverend Coleman.
One further point is that I think Mr. Wright's already brought it up, that religious or faith celebrants have a right but not a duty to solemnise a marriage. And that we would like, certainly if you're talking about protections, to safeguard the conscientious option of not going ahead with any given marriage for conscientious reasons. And that goes back in the history of most churches a very long time, irrespective of what sort of marriage we're talking about.
Anyone else?
I guess another thing, just to finally say about the concept of marriage, is that the view purported currently by most religions is this, a current view of marriage, but marriage, as you'll be aware, has been about owning children, about owning women, about denying rights, about stigmatization with illegitimacy, and all of these things are fundamentally changed. So this is just another small change to marriage that's being proposed, and that needs to be recognised, that if those who don't hold a religious view should be allowed to do that.
Thank you. Mr. Bevan? No, thank you. Thank you all very much for your contribution. That concludes today's meeting. Our next meeting will take place on Thursday, the 19th of September, and will include further oral evidence on the Marriage and Civil Partnership Bill. Thank you all very much.